Hidden economies. Shadow markets. Unofficial networks of power and wealth. We like to believe that nations are shaped by what's visible: laws, policies, institutions, leaders. But history tells us a different story. Again and again, empires do not rise because of what's written in their constitutions. They rise because of the wealth that moves outside them. And when nations collapse, it's rarely because of a single war or disaster. It's because these hidden economies, informal, unregulated, or outright illegal, quietly rot the foundation long before anyone notices. So the real question isn't what destroys nations. It's, who truly controls the flow of value when no one is watching. Today, we're stepping into a side of history that textbooks rarely discuss. A world where contraband kept empires alive, where black markets toppled governments, and where shadow finance rewrites the fate of nations even now. Because the greatest forces in history don't shout. They whisper. In every civilization, from ancient empires to modern superpowers, two economies exist at the same time. One is sanctioned, counted, taxed, measured. The other is invisible, yet often far larger and vastly more powerful. Scholars call this the informal economy. Governments call it a problem. But for most people throughout history, it has simply been survival. To understand how hidden economies shape entire civilizations, we need to step back, far back to one of the earliest complex societies, ancient Mesopotamia. In the bustling cities of Sumer, around 4,000 years ago, trade was strictly controlled by temple elites. The gods owned everything. The priests administered the food, the land, the labor. But as populations grew, something strange began to happen. Ordinary people started trading privately: grain for textiles, pottery for copper outside the temple system. At first it was small, insignificant. But soon, this informal exchange grew into a parallel marketplace. Archaeologists have found entire districts of unregulated stalls, buried under what used to be official temple grounds. These shadow merchants weren't just trading goods, they were rewriting the economic order. They were creating a new power base that existed outside the religious bureaucracy. And this pattern of a hidden economy undermining a centralized one would repeat across history like a drumbeat. Egypt, Greece, Rome. Whenever the official system became too rigid, the hidden one filled the gaps. But among all these civilizations, none were transformed more dramatically by shadow economies than the Roman Empire. Rome was built on conquest. Conquest brought slaves, gold, spices, land, an influx of wealth that overwhelmed the official treasury. As the empire expanded, so did the opportunities for unofficial profit. Roman generals took a cut of war spoils before reporting them. Tax collectors invented imaginary fees. Merchants smuggled goods through ports to avoid tariffs. By the time of the late Republic, the shadow economy wasn't a fringe. It was Rome's actual operating system. We know this because of an extraordinary discovery: tablets recording private merchant contracts, loans, shipments, deals conducted entirely outside state oversight. These tablets show something astonishing. By the 1st century BCE, Rome's underground financial network may have been larger than the official one. As the formal government strained under corruption and bureaucratic expansion, the informal economy became the empire's real engine. But over time, the two systems drifted apart like tectonic plates pulling in opposite directions. The political system relied on predictable revenues. But the shadow economy operated on secrecy, risk, and personal loyalty. When the gap became too wide, the empire fractured. Not because of barbarians at the gates, those were only the final blow. But because the state could no longer control the flow of value within its own borders. This is the first major pattern. A nation rises when its official and unofficial economies work together, and falls when they drift too far apart. Centuries passed. Empires rose, fell, and were buried beneath sand, jungles, ice. But the hidden economy never vanished. It only evolved. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe entered an age of exploration powered, ironically, by smuggling. Spain's vast colonial empire depended on gold and silver from the New World. But piracy, corruption, and illicit trade drained nearly 25% of it before it ever reached the treasury. British colonies in North America, restricted by imperial mercantilist laws, developed massive underground trading networks with French, Dutch, and Caribbean markets. By the time the American Revolution started, a third of all colonial commerce was technically illegal. In other words, the United States was born from a shadow economy. Smuggling wasn't a crime to most colonists. It was a lifeline and an act of defiance. George Washington, Robert Morris, and other founding elites privately benefited from these unofficial networks. They understood something the British government did not. Once a population depends on a hidden economy, control becomes nearly impossible. The revolution was inevitable not because of philosophy alone, but because the informal economy had grown too large to suppress. Fast forward to the 20th century, an era of rapid globalization, industrialization, and urbanization. But despite modern infrastructure and regulation, hidden economies didn't shrink. They exploded. In 1999, economist Hernando de Soto estimated that in many developing countries, the informal economy accounted for 60 to 70% of all employment and up to 50% of total income. This wasn't a black market in the criminal sense. It was simply economic life occurring outside official structures. Unregistered businesses, informal construction, cash-only labor, grassroots trade. From Cairo to Mumbai, from Rio to Lagos, nations were rising on the strength of an invisible workforce that governments could neither fully control nor ignore. But informal economies don't just support growth, they shape it. When they flourish, nations boom. When they become too large, too uncontrolled, or too entangled with corruption, countries become unstable. Nowhere is this clearer than in the story of the Soviet Union. The USSR was built on central planning. Prices, production, labor all decided from above. In theory, there was no need for an informal economy. In practice, it became essential. By the 1970s, Soviet citizens relied on BLAD, a complex network of favors, personal connections, and unofficial exchanges, to obtain everything from fresh food to medical supplies. Factories secretly traded raw materials behind the government's back. Workers stole parts from state workshops to barter for necessities. This shadow network kept the system functioning until it grew stronger than the official one. As corruption spread into every level of the bureaucracy, the state could no longer enforce its own rules. The economy collapsed not just because of inefficiency, but because the hidden economy had become the real economy. When the informal system finally snapped under the strain, the entire nation followed. And what emerged afterward? A new shadow economy, this time shaped by oligarchs, resource monopolies, and unregulated capital flows. Hidden economies do not disappear when a nation falls. They simply change hands. The pattern repeats. Ancient Rome. Imperial Spain. Colonial America. The Soviet Union. But what about today? Are hidden economies still shaping the world's rise and fall? The answer is not just yes. It is more than ever. Because in the 21st century, informality has gone digital. Cryptocurrency. Offshore banking. Unregistered remittances. Dark web markets. These aren't shadowy corners anymore, they are global power structures worth trillions. According to the United Nations, the modern shadow economy may represent over 20% of global GDP, and in some regions far more. Entire national budgets are dwarfed by the value of untracked capital flows. Supply chains rely on undocumented migrant labor. Real estate markets depend on offshore money. Major industries survive on tax loopholes and regulatory gray zones. And in many countries, political elites rely on hidden wealth to maintain power. This isn't a fringe problem. It is the spine of many modern economies. So the real question becomes: is the world entering an age where hidden economies are no longer the exception, but the rule? To see what that future might look like, consider one last example, one unfolding in real time. The global supply chain. On paper, it's a pristine system of trackable shipments, customs controls, digital documentation. In reality, it is riddled with informal practices. Cash bribes to speed up port processing, unofficial brokers managing container transfers, shadow fleets transporting sanctioned oil. During the pandemic, when official supply chains froze, these informal networks expanded massively. Goods continued moving not because governments planned it, but because hidden systems filled the gaps, just as they have for millennia. And this reveals the final truth about hidden economies. They are not just parasites on official systems. They are replacements waiting in the wings. When formal structures fail, informal ones take over. Which means the true story of nations is not just written in constitutions, laws, or treaties. It is written in the invisible exchanges that governments cannot control, but cannot survive without. So what does all of this ultimately mean? What do hidden economies teach us about the rise and fall of nations? Here are 3 insights. First, a nation's strength depends on alignment between its formal and informal systems. When they support each other, societies thrive. When they diverge, collapse begins quietly, invisibly, long before the headlines. Second, people will always create parallel markets when official ones fail. Whether in ancient Rome or modern cities, human survival does not wait for government permission. Shadow economies grow fastest when trust in institutions declines. Third, hidden economies are neither good nor bad. They are a signal. A sign that something in the official system is broken. A warning that leaders often ignore until it's too late. Every nation carries 2 heartbeats. One loud and public. One quiet and hidden. And history shows that it is the hidden heartbeat, the informal economy, that usually determines whether a nation endures, or collapses. If you found this story thought-provoking, share your thoughts in the comments. How much of your own country's economy do you think operates in the shadows? And what does that mean for its future? For more deep dive stories like this, consider subscribing. There is always more beneath the surface.